So booing and limited time, a little bit less time here maybe before lunch than planned, so I'm pretty sure I've had a dream about this situation before. But the good news is it's a catalyst for change and improv, so we're going to do that. I want to walk through my impressions of Scrum and SAFe. These are my impressions, and in order for my impressions to be meaningful for you, I want to start out by first walking through a little bit of who I am and what's shaped my perspective on these issues. So my foundation is in industrial and systems engineering, and I did that at USC. And industrial engineering is the root of where a lot of the productivity improvement methodologies come from, whether it's Deming or the team at Toyota. And it focuses on statistics and different process improvement techniques. And what's nice about industrial engineering is it gives the practitioner a foundation in the statistics and the mathematical, backing behind these methods that we use. And that creates a little bit of freedom to kind of go outside the lines and stick closer to the manifesto of Agile or the manifesto of Lean, rather than having to use the codified frameworks and implementations without question, right? And so then I went into systems engineering for a software development organization, and I was helping to run operations for a team of 100 people. We were inside of an organization of 800 people that was inside of an organization of thousands of people that's inside of an organization of hundreds of thousands of people. And so doing that, I got to see some of the design challenges that come up, some of the communications and scaling challenges, and some techniques that helped to resolve those. I liked helping resolve those things so much, I switched into an internal consultant role and started working with theory of constraints and Lean and scaling that out across a large engineering organization. And was lucky enough in that process to get to meet Mike Cohn when getting trained for Scrum, getting to meet Dean Leffingwell, getting trained for SAFe, and being able to talk about some issues with each framework with those gentlemen. And we'll look at the impact that had on my thinking in a couple slides. And then now I work primarily in a new product incubator, trying to help teams come up with new ways to move from idea to getting a product commercialized much faster. So my starting out point here is that Scrum alone is not a sufficient framework to be successful with development, okay? And I like Scrum a lot. I mentioned I went through theory of constraints, and a lot of the literature there is very, it's narrative driven, it's story driven. The Gold Rat books are novels, and it's really hard to turn that into practice. And when I found Mike Cohn's work, it really helped to make theory of constraints actionable through the Scrum model of managing work. But at the same time, when we switch to Scrum and we try to move away from big design up front and requirements documents, one of the things that makes that possible is the testing and some of the quality tools that document our code as artifacts of the development process. And if those aren't in place, for an enterprise especially, there's some risks if you go kind of Scrum only. So my position is that Scrum alone is not enough. So how does Scrum and SAFe compare? And as Paul said, this is kind of complex. SAFe is a huge topic. Scrum is a huge topic. So I want to focus on a few meaningful differences that relate to the challenge of scaling something and getting it adopted by an organization. So the first thing that we see is architecture, and that's over there. So in terms of architecture, I got a chance to talk to Mike Cohn about, how does Scrum handle architecture? How does that work? and where does it happen? And a lot of that conversation centered around the concept that in a smaller team, there might not be as much need for architecture. But when you're trying to coordinate the work of hundreds or thousands of employees on a given topic, it can become a little bit more important. And what Mike brought up is that, from his view, the Scrum approach was not necessarily designed for those types of activities. But if you had to do it, it would probably be good to do it with an upfront 1 or 2 iterations that focused on architecture and design, freeze that, and then move into the development work managed with Scrum. So I've highlighted that yellow here because it's a little bit of a risk area where maybe Scrum doesn't handle architecture quite as well as it could. In SAFe, architecture and design are handled with architectural epics and with architecture runways. The architecture runway is the concept that in order for the development team to leverage the architecture, it has to be sufficient that they know how to build to it. And they use the example of landing an airplane. If you're going to land an airplane, you have to have the runway in place first. And using a new architecture, the analogy is landing an airplane. The architectural epic is how those architectural runway changes are rolled out into the organization. This is in yellow too, which is kind of my caution color in the presentation, because it doesn't necessarily address where this happens. And so next we have managing development. So Scrum uses Scrum to manage development. So that's pretty straightforward. SAFe also uses Scrum to manage development, but they've modified Scrum. And they've modified Scrum with normalized story points. And that probably should be in yellow here. It'll be in yellow later. And we'll come back and look at why that's kind of an area of caution. When we look at managing the program level, Scrum uses the Scrum of Scrums. SAFe uses the Agile release train, and they focus on features and weighted shortest job first. And there's examples of both techniques working. When we talk about managing at the enterprise level, Scrum doesn't really have that language, and SAFe introduces this concept of the epic Kanban, but it's still a little bit abstract as to how that would actually be implemented by a practitioner. But at least people are starting to talk about it, which is useful. When we look at code quality, Scrum, by the book, stops at the acceptance criteria on the user story. And the challenge with that is that if we're really going to get rid of our design specs up front and use user stories for the Agile development, and we throw the user story away, which is what we do if we're by the book in Scrum, then we lose that documentation of our product unless we have some of the extreme programming quality tools like automated testing, auto-generated documentation, and these sorts of things. So I like that SAFe brings those in and says, yep, we're going to have acceptance criteria, but we're also going to make sure that we have our XP technical practices, and you're not going to be successful as an organization if you don't bring those in too. Politics and policy is also very important if you're trying to adopt something in a large organization, and if you're trying to get it adopted as a framework that you can use to sell to policy organizations like national governments, city governments, state governments. And SAFe addresses this partially, and I'm rating it here as a partial because I think they handle the internal politics right now in the current framework within a corporate organization. They're still needing to work on getting acceptance in the customer organization and getting the acquisition process, policy and guidance in place and accepted so that companies can use SAFe with confidence that their customer will buy what they're developing if they're working in an RFP context, which is common if you're developing for the government And then finally, there's a financial model component. And the financial model is important because this is how the engineering and design department is able to communicate in a meaningful way with the CFO finance organization. And if people have read the Phoenix Project, which was not my favorite book, but it makes a nice case that you need to be able to interface between finance and design and ops if you're going to be successful, and if you're going to be able to align what your designers are doing around the needs of the company. And so SAFE brings in this concept of cost of delay, and heavily borrowing from Don Reinertsen's work. And this is the part that got me excited about what SAFE was trying to add to the conversation about Agile. And so I want to briefly explain what this is for people who might not have seen it. So what is cost of delay? So cost of delay is the cost of coming late to market with the new product or service that you're trying to deliver. And we see cost of delay through three primary signs, I guess. One is theft. So if you're late to market, your idea can be stolen. And where we see this is anytime Apple is coming out with a product and we start finding out about what cases the vendors are designing and what shape the next iPhone or iPad is going to be before it gets released. That forces Apple to deliver quickly, otherwise you can start having copycat devices pop up before you ship. Obsolescence is if you're a Blu-ray manufacturer and you really want to get this great Blu-ray player out, but all your customers have moved on because you took too long and now they're watching their movies on Netflix. And lost sales is that delta between the market audience that you could have had if you'd released on time and the market that you end up with when you release late or with a delay. And Reinertsen talks about the cumulative flow diagram as a tool for visualizing this. And there's a great blog post with the URLs down here. It's by Mike Griffiths. It's called Creating and Interpreting Cumulative Flow Diagrams. For some reason, the PDF comes up higher in the search result than the blog post. And I'm not going to go into it here right now, but it's a great reference to look at if you're looking for a tool you can use that's very simple, low data to get it going, and it'll help you to see where the risks are of delays in your process and try to help identify where to focus to get rid of those. So we also talked about how SAFE added architecture concepts, code quality concepts, policy extension concepts that go a little bit beyond what Scrum deals with. So how do those help? All right, so first we want to look at what does it mean to scale something. And the context is thousands of employees up to hundreds of thousands of employees. Geographic scale, so multiple continents, multiple cities. Public policy integration, getting the government to buy in, or even local policymakers. And it's not necessarily because the government's buying it. It might be a situation like Tesla is facing in the United States, where car dealerships are opposed to Tesla selling direct. There's a policy issue that has to be resolved for them to be able to sell direct. Task variety and product variety as the company grows and takes on more initiatives, and supplier integration. How do you include the suppliers in this process to make sure that your vendors who you're subcontracting work to are able to participate? So all these issues come into play as we're scaling, and some of them might be more significant in hardware or mixed hardware-software projects. All right, so, and as we attempt to scale, there are a number of barriers that are common. I don't think I've captured them all here, but I wanted to highlight a few. And I want to look at how SAFE attempts to address some of these barriers. So sponsorship is one. having a sponsor for the initiative is like number one on almost every change methodology that I've ever encountered. And yet, so many times we go into the change without having that sponsor, and we fail. And then we wonder, well, why didn't that happen? So SAFE attempts to highlight that by bringing in the sponsor and making them part of the big picture. And that's both says that you need to have a sponsor, and it also makes the sponsor feel included as a stakeholder in the change that you're trying to bring to the organization. Confidence. People need to be confident in what you're trying to do. And so what we see is case studies coming out. Because even though from a statistics perspective, whether someone's selling Taco Bell burritos, or they're developing software, or they're developing lawnmowers or something, all those design cues kind of look the same. But to those people, there's a lot of uniqueness involved in that, and they don't look the same. And so they're going to ask you for a case. Is there anybody else out there in my industry or in my unique situation who's been successful with what you're trying to recommend that I do? And so, again, the reason people seek these cases is this issue of uniqueness. And one of the interesting things about SAFE is it's not necessarily super prominent in the framework, but there's language about having hooks in the framework for tailoring to tailor to the organization. You don't have to use SAFE exactly as specified. It exists as a template to help accelerate, but even Dean Leffingwell on his seminars for coaches will say there's hooks in SAFE where you can tailor to meet the needs of your organization. And that helps people to adopt the change. Language. So commonality of language is really important when we're trying to scale across dozens or hundreds of teams. And having something like the big picture to communicate that can help, because people need to know what each other are talking about for something to grow. Education. Having experienced both certification programs as a coach, I think the SAFE certification framework is more favorable to coaches, and that might be why it's kind of picking up some steam. And there are some risks with that, because maybe the barrier to getting certified can be a little bit lower in some cases. But it's important that certification program exists, the learning path is clear, and it's kind of integrated, and that's nice. Policy. So when I got trained for SAFE, the Software Engineering Institute was at the same training. They had a representative there. And that person was there because they're interested in, can they recommend to the government accounting office or the US DoD type organization, or the US the Food and Drug, or the health organization, to adopt scaled agile framework as an acquisition policy approach. And the SAFE leadership and thought leaders are really putting in a lot of effort to make those discussions happen and try to get that acquisition approach to come into being. And that's important in terms of allowing large organizations to invest in rolling out a change effort. So that's very important. We've talked about quality and the XP tools. And then tooling. So in tooling, for me, here is a risk area. We see the terms of SAFE being introduced into Rally and into version 1. Things at the portfolio level, things at the program level. And the challenge here is, if everyone on the team doesn't have access to the tool, in my experience and kind of what I've observed, typically the team really isn't using the methodology, because somebody else is statusing for them and putting data into this tool. So so I see this as a weakness right now. All right, so a few aspects to be cautious about. The normalized story points bothers me. I think that there's a lot of value in having that understanding of the team as a unique entity working together and what their independent velocity is. And I think that if you take the time to understand velocity and how it works, the issues that story point normalization seek to address kind of can drop away and not be as big of a barrier as they might seem. Weighted shortest job first, I really like as a concept. I'm not sure that we know yet how to do that because it requires understanding the value of the epic or the value of the feature. And oftentimes, for organizations coming from earned value management, value equates to what it costs to develop. And that's not going to get you the right weighted shortest job first. So there's some work that needs to be done in terms of how do you do this. We talked about the tools. I'm concerned about premature adoption as an acquisition framework. SAFe may or may not reach that stage, but if it did, as it is today, I don't think it gives us the jump we're looking for over the legacy acquisition framework, which is the waterfall method and kind of milestone design reviews, because the current implementation doesn't solve those issues that make projects fail in that context. I think they're moving toward it, though, in future iterations. And then lastly, while not as important as the others maybe, it bothers me that there's this emphasis always on face-to-face. Like we live in 2014. We have amazing collaboration tools available to us. And if you follow 37 Signals, now Basecamp, and read their book Rework, they talk about how they built a team with people all over the world. It allowed them to get the best people. And that skill differential of the people they brought into their organization outweighs maybe some of the communication difficulties that they face. And they're also able to organize the work in an intentional way that leverages where people live and the times of day that overlap and don't overlap. So I'm not a big fan of the insistence on face-to-face. So my conclusion on SAFe is that it's very useful today as a framework for enterprises to get started with the transition to Agile. But further iterations can continue to make it better. And I want to briefly explain what that might look like, one possibility. So, where do we look for the end state? Where might SAFe be going? Where might some other framework be going? And a lot of this, comes from Toyota as product development. Definitely it shapes SAFe. It seems like it also shapes Agile thinking. And so if we accept that we want to achieve the outcomes of flow of value, we want elimination of wasted resources and activities, we want respect for people in our team, then it's interesting to look at, have we made an assumption here that Toyota does design the same way that they handle production? And so we need to look at, how does Toyota get there? How does Toyota do design? And so what we see is that Toyota does not use point-based design. And MIT has kind of looked into this, and there's only a couple papers. It's hard to find this stuff. It's kind of like Toyota open-sourced their production process because that helps them interface with suppliers. But they didn't open-source their design process as competitive advantage. And MIT's done a little bit of looking into it, but it's still, there's not a lot of literature out there. And what happens is in this point-based design situation, if you miss your milestone because you focus on one type of engine for your car, let's say a hybrid engine, and you're developing the engine, whether it's Agile or waterfall or whatever approach, and you arrive at the production readiness decision, are we going online with manufacturing this thing? and that engine doesn't work, and there's no backup plan because it's point-based design, what ends up happening is your schedule slips because you have to redo the design effort. Hey, let's go back to the internal combustion engine, let's start from scratch. So what MIT has found that Toyota does is a set-based design. They keep, and I'm going to fabricate the engine example because it's convenient to talk about, but what Toyota does is they keep multiple technology alternatives in play throughout the development of a new vehicle. So if they want the electric engine, they'll have a hybrid engine as maybe a middle step, and they've got the internal combustion engine that they know how to build and they can fall back on, and they mature all three of those in parallel. And what that does is it gives a set of potential technologies. Those technologies are modular. They can be switched out for one another. And that means when they get to that decision point that says, we need to pick an engine today and start the factory, or we're going to miss our target shipment date, and we're going to have lost sales, they're able to move forward with the technology that's closest to what they want, but it works today. Right? So maybe they don't get to the electric engine, but they got the hybrid working. They can leave the gasoline engine behind and introduce the hybrid vehicle. And so my challenge to everyone as an Agile community is, as a group, how do we challenge the assumption that design is the same as production? And if we acknowledge some of the uniqueness around design, how do we then incorporate set-based design, the lean design that we observe with Toyota, how do we incorporate that so that it's a feeder for the lean production methods that we already know how to do, and in software that apply to DevOps and maybe maintenance, maybe some other tasks? How do we also bring in the lean set-based design, whether that's in SAFe or any other framework that'll let us, that'll boost us ahead, that'll get us to that next level of effective development? So, thank you.